They called it cocaine clause, two words that rippled through Hollywood like perfume over smoke, intoxicating, scandalous, unforgettable. It wasn't a song or a film, but a single paragraph buried deep inside a prenuptial agreement, a line of ink that dared to put a price on purity for every year that Keith Urban stayed clean. Nicole Kidman would pay him $6 million, $6 million for a year of sobriety, $6 million for a year of trust, $6 million for a promise that love alone could not keep. It sounds absurd. Like a rumor whisper at the edge of a red carpet, yet it held the weight of desperation, because behind Nicole's porcelain grace and Keith's easy smile, there lived a fear older than fame itself, the fear of losing the one thing money can't repair: faith. They were Hollywood's golden couple, their wedding vows framed by flash bulbs and champagne. But as the ink dried on their contract, a quiet truth began to echo beneath the glitter. Sometimes even love needs a lawyer. Was it protection, or prophecy? Did Nicole write a safeguard or a countdown? And if Keith stayed sober for 20 years, would that clause become a blessing or a reward for survival? No one knew. But in the city where every secret eventually shines, the cocaine clause became more than gossip. It became a mirror reflecting the fragile line between devotion and control, affection and fear, love and law. Before there was fame, before there were red carpets and diamond rings, there were two children learning to live with silence. Nicole Kidman was born beneath a sky that didn't yet know her name. Her father, a psychologist chasing answers in the human mind, and her mother, a nurse with the gentlest hands, filled the house with intellect, but not always with warmth. As the family moved from Hawaii to Sydney, Nicole carried with her an invisible companion, the ache of being unseen. She was tall, pale, fragile, a child who preferred to listen rather than speak. The other girls in school learned to charm. She learned to vanish while the world outside spun. Faster, her refuge was the darkened cinema, the one place where loneliness looked beautiful. There she watched faces larger than life, lips trembling with words she couldn't say herself. She decided that if she couldn't belong to the world, she would become its dream. Instead, acting wasn't just a career waiting to happen. It was survival. Each role she played was another skin, another way to hide the soft child who trembled beneath across the sea. Another child was learning the language of escape, but his came in chords, not words. Keith Urban grew up in New Zealand, where the nights were longer than the songs on the radio. His father sold motors, his mother smiled through the exhaustion of bills and worries. And Keith, the youngest dreamer in a small, hard world, found magic in his father's guitar music. Was his rebellion against silence, his way of telling the world that he was still breathing. But dreams can be dangerous when they grow faster than the heart. By the time he was a teenager, Keith had already tasted the restless rhythm of the stage and the poisons that kept musicians awake through the night. Cocaine was not a thrill. It was anesthesia. It numbed the doubt, the fear, the endless hunger to be enough. In the glitter of bars and the fog of smoke, the boy with a guitar began to fade into someone else, a performer built to survive applause, but not loneliness. Nicole, meanwhile, was stepping into her own kind of stage. She trained at drama schools in Sydney, then in New York, where her accent softened. But her ambition sharpened. She played women who broke hearts, women who were broken, women who dared, yet beneath every flawless performance was a quiet plea to be loved, not for perfection, but for the imperfection she hid. So, while there were two souls crafted by absence, two children who grew up learning that love could leave without saying goodbye. When the world finally noticed them, it wasn't because they were whole, but because they carried their wounds like light. Nicole's elegance was her armor. Keith's charm was his apology. They learned that survival often looks like success, and that sometimes the most famous faces are just the loneliest children who never stopped performing. Before they met, they were already tied by the same invisible thread, one spun from pain, ambition, and the desperate hope that art could mend what life had broken. They were destined to find each other, not because the stars aligned, but because their scars did. Began on a summer night in Los Angeles at an event celebrating Australians who had conquered Hollywood. Beneath the chandeliers of the Getty LA gal, Nicole Kidman glided through the room. Like moonlight dressed in silk, the world saw her as untouchable, an Oscar winner, survivor, heartbreak, the woman who had rebuilt herself in the ruins of marriage that once defined her. She was grace sharpened by solitude, light sculpted by loss. And then across the room, Keith Urban saw her. He wasn't the loudest star in the crowd, but there was something about his presence, that quiet drawl, that unguarded sincerity that cut through the noise. A man who once battled addiction was now sober, steady, humble, carrying the kind of silence only the wounded can wear. When their eyes met, something ancient moved between them. Recognition, maybe, or the quiet relief of finding someone who understood the cost of survival. Their first conversations were hesitant, soft, like tuning an instrument in a crowded room. He spoke to her as if fame were a language that neither of them needed to translate. As if the world, with all its flashing lights and microphones, had finally gone silent. Nicole listened to him like someone who had been waiting her whole life to hear something real, something unpolished. For the first time in years, she wasn't acting. And for the first time in years, Keith didn't need a song to be understood. What drew them together wasn't glamour or grandeur. It was a quiet, trembling recognition of two people who had spent their lives pretending they were fine and suddenly didn't have to anymore. Their love wasn't written in headlines or choreographed for cameras. It wasn't built on lavish gestures or cinematic kisses. It lived in the small human moments. The way she looked at him when he spoke about his demons, not with pity, but with an unwavering kind of belief. The way he held her hand in public, steady and unashamed, even when the tabloids refused to let go of his past. What they shared was fragile, yes, but it was also fearless. A whispered promise that maybe, just maybe, two broken souls could learn to hold each other without breaking further. In June of 2006, as the sun melted into the Sydney horizon, they made that promise official. Their wedding took place in a small church, lit only by candlelight and the sound of guitar. Nicole wore ivory lace, timeless and simple. Keith stood at the altar, voice trembling as he sang to her, a melody that wasn't written for radio, but for redemption. When they kiss, the world called it the perfect ending to two separate heartbreaks. But those who have lived long enough to know love's shadow understood. It was only the beginning of another story. Behind the laughter, the champagne, and the vows whispered into microphones, there was paper, a prenuptial agreement, a document neither of them wanted to discuss. Yet both needed to understand. For Nicole, it was protection, not only a wealth but a hope, a fragile fence around a love she couldn't bear to lose to chaos. For Keith, it was proof that he could be trusted, that he could stay clean, that he could earn back something more valuable than applause. Faith. Somewhere in the sterile language of lawyers and ink, a peculiar line found its way into the contract. $6 million for every year Keith Urban remained sober. The world would later nickname it the cocaine clause. To outsiders, it sounded scandalous, almost cruel. But to Nicole, it was something entirely different. Faith disguised as formality. She wasn't buying his purity. She was buying time. Time for him to heal. Time for them to survive. Time for love to defeat the ghost that had already claimed so many before them. For Keith, that clause wasn't humiliation. It was motivation, not a dollar sign, but a heartbeat. Every year he stayed sober. He wasn't counting millions. He was counting days. Days he woke up clear-headed. Days he didn't numb himself. Days he could look at Nicole and know he was still the man she believed in. The money meant nothing. What mattered was that he was alive. And Nicole didn't owe him the reward. She owed it to the man he was fighting to become. Together, they built a kind of fortress, part melody, part film reel. She chased truth through her characters. He searched for it through his songs. Awards came. So did rumors. But for a time, their love burned quietly, defiantly, untouched by the cynicism of the world. They became Hollywood's antidote, the proof that love, when stripped of pretense, could still survive the spotlight. He was a man redeemed. She was a woman reborn. Together, they were love resurrected from ashes. But in Hollywood, every fairy tale comes with clause, and theirs had already been signed. The world fell in love with their love. Nicole and Keith became a single phrase, like melody and harmony. Wherever they went, cameras followed, desperate to capture whatever it was that made them glow. On red carpets, their hands fit together like puzzle pieces. In interviews, they spoke softly of home, of their daughters, of the miracle of ordinary mornings. The tabloids called them the golden couple. Magazines declared they had defied the Hollywood curse. For a while it was true. Nicole had become the cinematic swan, luminous, ageless, untouchable. After the Hours won her an Oscar, she dove into roles that blurred the line between beauty and madness. Moulin Rouge, Australia, The Others. Every performance was a confession in disguise, a love letter to imperfection. She played women who carried secrets, women who loved too deeply, women who lost everything and smiled through it anyway. Keith told the same story, but his language was music. His voice, gravel and grace. His guitar, confession and prayer. Each album turned pain into poetry. He wrote of nights that nearly ended him, of love that saved him, of the woman who gave him a reason to wake up clean. Every chorus was a confession. Every spotlight was a reminder that sobriety, too, was a kind of performance, one that never truly ended. Together, they seemed unstoppable. They built a quiet life in Tennessee, far from the glittering chaos of Los Angeles. On their farm, mornings smelled of wet earth and coffee instead of perfume and flashbulbs. Nicole planted roses. Keith built a recording studio beside the fields. Friends described them as grounded, almost ordinary. To the world, they were proof that love could outlast fame. But fame is never gentle. It doesn't whisper. It roars. It builds you up only to remind you how far you can fall. Behind their perfect smiles, the contract still lingered. The prenuptial agreement that had begun as protection now hummed like a faint echo of distrust. Nicole, who had once watched her marriage to Tom Cruise unravel under the weight of public scrutiny, guarded her heart through structure, her hope through legality. Keith, though endlessly grateful, could sometimes feel the invisible weight of that clause pressing against him. The expectation to be perfect, to stay clean, to remain worthy of a love measured not in moments, but in millions. He would joke in interviews about being a lucky man, but behind the laughter was a man quietly balancing redemption on a wire. And yet, through it all, they endured. When Keith toured, Nicole followed, from one continent to another, from arenas echoing with guitars to hotel rooms filled with toys and bedtime stories. Their daughters grew up between airports and film sets, their parents always trying to keep a sense of normal in a life that was anything but. When Nicole filmed, Keith waited at the edge of the set with flowers, quiet pride in his eyes. They never stopped showing up for each other, never stopped trying to hold on. In a world that delights in watching love crumble, they fought to prove that there's a survive. But even golden things cast shadows. With every new success came another layer of pressure, another round of speculation, another reminder that perfection has a price. The whispers began to circle again, the same old rumor resurrected like a ghost. The cocaine clause. To some, it was proof that Nicole didn't trust him. To others, it was evidence that Keith had surrendered freedom for stability. Neither confirmed, neither denied. They smiled for cameras, walked red carpets hand in hand, and left the world to wonder what truth might be hiding behind the practiced grace of their smiles. Behind closed doors, they fought quietly, painfully. Not the kind of fights meant to wound, but the kind meant to survive. The arguments weren't about winning. They were about holding on. Keith's demons didn't vanish. They never do. They only learned to whisper. And Nicole's fear of losing the people she loved didn't die either. It simply learned to smile. The world saw grace. The truth was grit. They had built a golden life, yes, but it was forged from compromise and sacrifice. The fairy tale still shimmered for the cameras, but beneath it, the foundation trembled. And somewhere, buried in the silence of their success, that one line in a contract, $6 million per year sobriety, waited like a ghost, patient and silent. Because in Hollywood, no matter how bright the spotlight burns, every promise eventually casts a shadow. It began as a whisper, not from their home, but from the world outside their gates. Tabloids, podcasts, gossip blogs, the machine that feeds on perfection. Someone mentioned those words again, the cocaine clause. This time, they came attached with a $sign and a smirk. And just like that, the dream began to fracture. Reporters claimed Nicole Kidman had built her marriage like a fortress made of conditions. They said Keith Urban's love came with a salary. $6 million a year for sobriety. The headlines read, to the public, it was scandal. To lawyers, it was absurd. To fans, it was betrayal. But the real damage wasn't in what was written. It was in what it revealed, that even love, when filtered through fame, could begin to sound like a transaction. Inside their home, the air shifted. Trust, that invisible thread that holds two souls together, began to stretch thin. Nicole, once radiant in her calm, grew quieter. Keith, once steady in his recovery, began to feel the ground tilt beneath him. Where it once felt like a safety net, now felt like a leash. The contract, designed to protect them, began to haunt them instead. Holly J. Moore, a Los Angeles divorce attorney who first spoke publicly about the clause, explained that lifestyle clauses like this, conditions tied to behavior, morality, or purity, rarely hold weight in court. In California, they're not even legal. You can't contract someone into morality, she said. But what happens when morality becomes survival? Nicole knew better than most what happens when love collapses under the weight of fame. She had lived through it once before, through the implosion of her first marriage beneath the glare of the cameras. She knew the way the world feeds on a woman's heartbreak, the way it turns private pain into public spectacle. Maybe that's why she wanted a clause. To keep Keith safe, to keep herself safe, to turn something fragile into something measurable. She wanted to give form to faith. But intentions like hearts can twist under pressure. To Keith, over time, the clause began to change shape. It stopped feeling like protection and started feeling like a countdown. 20 years clean would mean $120 million if the rumors were true. The tabloids laughed. Stay sober, get rich. But for Keith, the money meant nothing. What haunted him was a question behind it. Did she believe in him, or only in the paper that promised he'd stay clean? He stopped answering interview questions about it. His music grew darker, slower, more introspective. The man who once sang about redemption began to sing about weight, invisible weight. His melodies turned into confessions, his lyrics into prayers. Nicole, meanwhile, disappeared into her characters. On screen, she became women who looked eerily like herself, poised on the surface, fractured underneath. Women torn between control and surrender. Women who smiled beautifully while quietly falling apart. Her art had always been her refuge, but now it felt like a mirror she couldn't escape. By their 19th anniversary, the sheen had dulled. The smiles at premieres looked polite, practiced. The laughter on talk shows sounded like echoes. The silence between them stretched longer than the applause that followed their appearances. Then came the whispers that Keith had left their Nashville estate for a while, that Nicole had flown to London alone, that the cocaine clause, once a myth, had become a weapon. Holly Moore said something that lingered with everyone who heard it. If that clause activates only upon divorce, then it becomes an incentive, a financial reward for ending the marriage, a reward for failure. If that were true, then the love that clause was meant to protect had been outbid by the very paper that defined it. In a cruel twist, the line that once stood for faith had turned into evidence of its absence. For two people who had built their lives on redemption, there could be no deeper wound. Hollywood, as always, devoured their pain. Talk shows dissected the legality. Commentators debated loyalty. Fans took sides. But no one could see what truly happened behind those thick stone walls. In the golden home of a woman who loved too carefully and a man who fought too hard. It wasn't a scandal. It was a slow, beautiful heartbreak. The kind that doesn't explode, it erodes. And in the center of it all, that clause still lingered, not as a price tag or punishment, but as a mirror. It reflected not greed, not betrayal, but something much simpler and much sadder, fear. Because, in truth, the cocaine clause was never really about money. It was about the quiet, desperate price of believing that love could be managed, contained, or protected by rules. When the gossip finally cooled and the world moved on to fresher scandals, the rumors stayed behind like a ghost, unseen but always felt, haunting the corners of their names. No one ever proved it existed, and no one ever denied it. That silence, perhaps, was the most truthful thing about it, because the clause itself wasn't the story. What mattered was what it revealed, what it tried to hold together before it all slipped apart. For Nicole Kidman, love had always been a kind of endurance sport, something practiced through heartbreak, humiliation, and long nights when applause could not quiet the loneliness. She knew the exhaustion of being worshipped and misunderstood at the same time, the ache of being admired but never entirely seen. To love again after Tom Cruise had been an act of rebellion, a refusal to let the world decide the ending for her. But to love Keith Urban, a man still at war with his own reflection, was something different altogether. It wasn't romantic in the Hollywood sense. It was spiritual, raw, and perilously human. It was survival by proximity. So when she asked her lawyers to draft that now legendary prenuptial clause, she wasn't scripting a contract. She was writing a prayer. Somewhere between the legal lines, she was whispering, "Please let this one last." She wanted to give love a shape, something she could touch, hold, sign, something that couldn't vanish with relapse or a headline. Ink, she thought, could do what emotion sometimes couldn't. Stay. If she could define faith on paper, maybe it wouldn't dissolve in fear. It wasn't control. It was fear wearing a sensible disguise. And Keith, the boy who had once sung through the noise of his pain, understood that fear all too well. He'd seen what addiction did. It took friends, stole futures, rewrote promises into eulogies. When Nicole placed that agreement in front of him, he didn't see an insult. He saw faith, clumsy, trembling, imperfect faith. The $6 million figure wasn't a bribe. It was a lifeline, a way of saying, stay alive, stay here. What the public never understood was that the clause wasn't about purity. It was about preservation. Behind their red carpet smiles were two people trying to outsmart fate. Both had come from landscapes where love was fragile and easily crushed by ego, by temptation, by the merciless spotlight. The prenup was never a weapon. It was a shield, a strange act of devotion written in legalese. Nicole wasn't saying I doubt you. She was saying I need to believe in something that will keep you safe when I can't. Holly J. Moore, the divorce lawyer whose interview reignited the debate, once said, "We never truly know what happened behind closed doors." And maybe that's the sacred truth of every marriage, celebrity or not. The world sees the ring, the photos, the curated laughter. It doesn't see the quiet negotiations that happen at midnight, the tears swallowed in different rooms, the fragile apologies that hold two people together by a thread. The public wants proof of love. Real love rarely leaves any. In a cruel irony, the clause built to hold them together eventually became the symbol of what was pulling them apart. But perhaps that was never tragedy. It was design, because love in its truest form is not clean. It is not sober. It does not obey signatures or clauses. It's a trembling thing, wild and soft at once, a flame that flickers even when sealed behind glass. Maybe, after all the years and the headlines, Nicole and Keith weren't trying to cheat gravity. They were simply learning how to fall gracefully. Years later, when someone asked Nicole what she believed about love, she smiled that familiar movie star smile, gentle, distant, practiced. "I believe in forever," she said, "but I also believe in change." Only someone who has survived both could say something so devastatingly calm. Maybe the cocaine clause never existed at all. Or maybe it did, exactly as whispered. Either way, it tells the same truth. When love is real, it will always try to protect itself, even if it must disguise that protection as law. And if that is a sin, then every lover who has ever tried to save another's life is guilty too. No court ever read the document aloud. No lawyer ever waived it in evidence. It lived only in rumor, an invisible thread connecting a woman who loved too cautiously and a man who healed too slowly. Perhaps that's how it was meant to remain, intangible and unresolved, like most real things in life. Some truths don't need proof. They need peace. Today, Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban still move through the same orbit. Music, memory, the gentle echo of what they once built. Their story isn't about contracts or clauses. It's about two souls who tried desperately to build a promise strong enough to outlast fear. The papers, the signatures, the gossip, all of it was scaffolding around something fragile and human. Maybe the cocaine clause was never about addiction. Maybe it was about devotion, about how love, when frightened, reaches for structure, how hope, when wounded, puts its faith in numbers because it no longer trusts words. Every great love leaves a scar. Theirs was written not in betrayal, but in the trembling effort to keep each other alive. And when the lights dim and the rumors fade, what lingers is not the scandal but the ache, the soft, enduring knowledge that even love born of fear is still love. Some people write songs, some write vows, and some, like Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban, write their love into law because they are too human, too fragile, too hopeful to risk losing it again. Love always demands a price, and sometimes paying it is the only way to prove it was real.